Take Command Podcast, Logan Paulsen there, Craig Hoffman here. So this one from Upweller_Josh on Instagram, who hit me at Hoffman.sports, Logan. Basic question. We've answered a version of this the past couple of years around draft time, but it's worth re-upping the answer. We got a lot of new audience. Hey, everybody new. Thanks for listening. In the draft, should AP/Quinn go for best player available or draft for need? And I think this is actually worth discussing because this is a very different draft than last year for Washington. And we've talked around this topic quite a bit over the last couple of months of doing this draft work now, where Washington last year picking second, knew exactly the direction they wanted to go. This year, you were and knew that option would be available. This year, you're very much at the mercy of the board. And so this question becomes a little bit more complicated. And I think it's time for our yearly reminder of how this actually works in a draft room and how this question on some level answers itself.
Yeah, so I think this is it's always good to kind of talk through this. And I think people, they think best player available, like they think, I don't really know what they think, but they have this perception that it's just like you throw need out the window completely. And that's just not, frankly, how it works, because best player available is different on every big board. Like there is some consensus, right? Like there's like, hey, when you list the players out 1 to 300, there's going to be a general consensus, but you're going to have outliers there, right? So obviously your big board's going to differ from other teams. So best player available for me is not necessarily the best player available for Craig.
Right. And that could be from scouting differences. We might see the player differently. Or if we run different schemes, that player that's awesome for you might not be worth it for me.
Yeah, and I think that's just a good point to understand. Like, Dan at the Combine was talking about the type of edge rusher that he prefers, right? Guys that can really get off the ball. So that, again, like I'm not saying they're going to draft a guy who's going to have a good 10, but if you look at his history, he does value guys that have that ability to kind of juice off the football, right, at a high level. So he's probably going to value that position. Adam Peters going to value that trait a little bit more. So best player available shifts a little bit. Also, need. I've talked to a head of college scouting or a player personnel guy, and he was just like, it need factors into best player available. So, for example, like if I'm a quarterback needy team, quarterbacks get a little bit more value. You multiply them by like 1.2 on your board. Again, like whatever your grade is, let's say my grade's 20, right? You multiply by 1.2, and eventually that gets them into like probably a top 10 range for most quarterbacks. You say, okay, so now this quarterback, which we need because we multiplied by 1.2, is now in our top 10 of players available. So there is some kind of fungibility there. And again, it's a subjective thing also. So like, for example, at 29, right? I think Adam Peters, and I'm going to give him his flowers here, has done a great job of saying like this, we've got our roster to a really good baseline. And we talked about it on our last episode about how in free agency, they kind of really, with all the people they brought in, raised the floor, right? They said, hey, this is our new floor. And now we can kind of put the accents on the roster, hopefully through the draft. And so for me at 29, like best player available now looks like who is going to bring the most athletic upside to the defense, probably, right? Again, like let's say that, for example, like Josh Simmons is there at 29 and he's hypothetically, I have no idea what their big board looks like, but let's say he's a top 10 player on their big board and he's there at 29. You're still going to take Josh Simmons, right?
Yeah. The offensive tackle out of Ohio State.
He's the best player on your board, hypothetically, at that spot. However, I do think that because of the signing of Laramie Tunsil, that becomes a little bit less needy, right? So like, let's say, for example, it's like Josh Connerly from Oregon, and you say he's the 30th player on your board. There's good value there taking him at 29, but now because of how my roster dynamics have shifted, I'm going to value probably edge, probably safety, probably corner a little bit more. So like Siobhan Ravel from ECU, if he's available there, like you're probably like, this is the best player on our board now, even though Connerly and him have similar grades because of our need and because of the kind of player we're looking for at this spot, we'd probably go in that direction. So that's where need, best player available, gets a little bit wishy-washy, in my opinion, because it does shift based on your team needs. And so I think it's important to understand that just kind of contextually going into this. And now what I think is, based on what they've done in free agency, you probably shift to like saying edge, corner, safety. Like I do think those are probably the direction they go with the pick. But like, for example, if they say, oh, there's a defensive tackle here that we really, really like, I don't know, if Walter Nolan drops to 29, for example, and you've got, a top 10 grade on him, I don't care what your roster looks like. You're going to take that player because again, the value there is astronomical compared to your grade and where you're picking.
Which is what they did last year with Johnny Newton. I don't know that they went into that draft being like, we're going to draft John Allen's replacement, but Johnny Newton was by far the best player on their board, which we saw in the behind the scenes stuff afterwards that the team put out, the commander's log, because, you know, they obviously blocked out most of the names, but ultimately they had their tiers up on the board in the war room. And Johnny Newton, after they took him, they took his name off the top tier. He was the only one left. And so they got lucky there based off what they thought of the player, that he was available at the top of the second round for them and was able to be drafted, even though they had, you know, probably a top 15, top 18 grade. Like, you don't hand out 32 first round grades. It's not how the grading system works for most teams. There's kind of a raw grade, if you will. And so what need becomes is the tiebreaker. Is okay, and you did, I think, such a good job last year explaining this, and we'll probably do another version of this year where we go through like your top couple of tiers, where like you build your board as if you were a general manager. It's part of your scouting process that you do, and it's really insightful because it's like, okay, these are the players in the top A bucket. These are the players in the B bucket. These are the players in the C bucket. And so if you get on the board and there's a player in the A bucket available, and there's only one, you take the A player.
Yeah.
If you're the Commanders at 29 and you have 5 players left in the B bucket, then you go, okay, which one of these players helps us the most? Who's the best player available for us? Right. And that's where that tiebreaker comes in of like, we consider these players all pretty equal. Otherwise, one of them would be down a tier, or one of them would have been up a tier. And then this guy, you know, for us, we think he's the best guy. And that's where the positional need, or maybe there's another factor. I mean, it doesn't always have to come down to that, because maybe you kind of equally need a corner and an edge or whatever. And I really liked our meeting with that guy. I have a gut feeling about 100%. It. And I'm Adam Peters, and I'm going to trust my gut. Like, it's not all science. And I think that's the other thing too, is like, people want this all to be the same uniform for every team. This is an art in a lot of ways. If this was a science, then people would have figured out some science by now. But in a sport with 22 guys on the field at once, and schematics and all that kind of stuff constantly changing, there's no way it can be a science, because the target that you're trying to hit at all these positions is constantly moving. The last thing I'll just say about that is, because of that, and because of the way the contracts are structured, you just go best player available, because you're always a year or two away from having a need at every position in the sport, quarterback 100%. Hopefully excluded, when you have a guy like Jaden Daniels.
Yeah, and I think I couldn't have said it better. And I think maybe we should have done the tier thing to start this, but I think that's a huge element in understanding like what we're talking about. And I think you did a great job of understanding it, so I'm not going to repeat it. But the other thing too that I think is incredibly important is like, it is the subjective element of evaluation is important to understand, but also kind of the soft science of human being and relationships. So I remembered this story while you were talking, because it reminded me of this, but like Alfred Morris, you know, I remember when he was coming to Washington, like he got drafted in the 6th round, and I just said, how did you find this guy? Like, what was, you know, I was talking to, I forget who I was talking about. How did you find him? Because he obviously was balling out that year, right? He's running hard. He's a great kid. And basically the guy was like, you know what, it was between him and another running back in the 6th round. And they went to Bobby Turner, and Bobby's like, I like Alfred better. He's a better kid. Let's draft him. That was what it was. Like there was no difference in film. My personal relationship was better with Alfred at the
and that
time.
Matters, right?
And
because
it's important, right?
Think of the coaches that you played for that you liked and liked you, and what they poured into you, and thus what they're able to get out of you as a player, versus like if you have any level of reluctance coaching a guy, like you're not going to give that player the best. It's not fair to the player. It's not fair to the team. And so that stuff ultimately matters a lot, especially if it's between two guys at one position. Like, who the position coach feels like he can get the most out of, who they can reach, like, that's pretty important.
And I think that's just really important for fans to understand, is like at 29, for example, like there's going to be a lot of good players like Donovan Ezeraku from Boston College, like James Pierce might be there, right? And so what's the distinguishing factor in those guys? Because there's pros and cons to both players. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for them to be like, we like player of those two, player X better, right? And that's the way you go. And people, you know, Mel Kiper's going to go, oh, I have a higher grade on James Pierce Jr., but He never met with James Pierce Jr. He never talked to him, right? And if James Pierce Jr. came here, great. If Donovan Ezraku came here, great. But that's based on my evaluation. I've never met the guy, right? So if my personal relationship or my personal understanding of fit is better with one player, like that's best player available for me. So like there's all the film, all the testing, the meetings are important, fit, schematic fit, all that kind of gets woven in and stirred up and bakes this beautiful thing that is best player available. And need is factored in there somewhere, but how much need you're dosing into this little baking concoction you made is dependent on team and dependent on kind of organizational philosophy. And so that's, again, like when you look at Philly, I think they're a great example. They're always drafting quote unquote best player available, right? But in reality, they're drafting for need because of the reason you just talked about, because they know that, Lane Johnson's going to retire in 2 years. And so they want to make sure they got someone in-house, an offensive lineman to develop. And for 2 years, while Lane's kind of playing out his contract, they did the same thing with Jason Kelce. Like that's their organizational philosophy. And so because Adam Peters is so new, we haven't really determined what that is yet. But we do know one thing that's really important. More than the RAS question is that they want the right kind of person. And so that's something that we won't know until they draft the guy. And usually, like, did you see this is a little bit of an aside, but did you see the Kinlaw interview on the Commander's YouTube page?
Yeah, I have seen it. Yeah.
Like, talk about a dude who is a commander from a mentality standpoint. And so obviously that's something that they value incredibly. And so, like, we won't get to see that side of these guys until after they've signed. So again, best player available versus need. Little fungible, but I think you did a good job, Craig, at talking about the tiers and kind of how that all works together. So
thank you, as did you in all that. Last thing too is, like, can you over-index on one position? Yeah, I think when the Commanders took 4 straight first round defensive linemen, for instance, and they're not the only team that's done this, right? Like the Lions famously took 4 receivers in a row. Now for them it was because like three or whatever of them busted, so it didn't really work out. But like they had top 5 picks and took a bunch of receivers in a row and it didn't work out. But like then you wind up with some contract issues and like how much money, if they all work out, how much money are we investing in one position group? What does that leave? And like that leaves you thin elsewhere. So like, yes, it is possible to over index at one position. If the Commanders take a defensive tackle at the first overall pick or their first pick this year, that's back-to-back years is not going to over-index you for Jerzon Newton and Walter Nolan or whoever that might wind up being. So the Commanders are definitely not in risk of doing that. And ultimately, like, those are good problems to have. If you hit on too many draft picks and you have to figure out the contracts a couple years down the line, okay. Hopefully you can maybe trade a guy and get some return, or you can figure it out. But like, first things first, hit on those draft picks, and that's something else that I think is worth mentioning. Last thing for this, we can go through this quickly, and then because I think we're going to get into potentially one of the potential answers here to wrap up the show, Logan. But Jay Buddy asks, what is now the Commanders' number one positional need? So now we've had this need versus BPA discussion, and we've said that need influences who is actual BPA. Who's getting the biggest point multiplier on the positional need here after free agency?
Yeah, I think that again, it's a good question, and I think we kind of alluded to it there just briefly. I think it's one of those defensive spots, and I guess I'd probably put receiver in there as of right now. Like, for example, if there's a really good football player, I'm trying to think of the receivers that I have graded high.
Is Mbuka high enough for you?
Mbuka is a good player. I don't think he's there, but again, like that's a weird selection with Mbuka to me, because to me he's like a pure slot, and you already have Debo here. Like, I don't think he plays outside. So again, like that for my big board for the Commanders, I put him down a little bit lower than someone I think could play outside. Right. Inhuman Wari from Stanford is a true X. I would probably have him a little bit lower in terms of pure skill, but maybe in this example, or Higgins, right, from Iowa State, maybe you bump that guy's value because you think he's a better pure outside guy, right? And that's what happens, right? It's the same thing with like nickel versus outside corner, right? They're different positions, and I think that's something that the national media, in my opinion, doesn't do a very good job of, is distinguishing, saying like, hey, this stylistic fit for Mbuka is not right? It doesn't fit his skill set. It doesn't fit what he's good at. Like, this other player who we've drafted
Yeah.
is a better fit kind of for what we're looking for. Yeah, but I'd probably say those 4 positions as of right now.
I will say real quick on that. This is something that I want to discuss with you soon on a show. I thought Derek Klassen made a really interesting point on the Athletic Football show that I was listening to. I think it's their Monday show, when he talked about the Seahawks having JSN and Cooper Kupp now.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, and Robert Mays was like, is this weird because they're both guys that primarily line up in the slot? And Derek goes, so many of these offenses are so condensed now that your outside guy is lining up inside the numbers anyway.
Yeah.
And so having 2 slot receivers is actually not as bad of a thing. I think that would be fun to explore in general and fun to explore with the Commanders. So I'm putting that thought pin in your head.
Sure.
That knowing you'll now think about that all week, and we'll talk about it like next week or something. But I think that is like the point being, for the purpose of this question, like, is very scheme dependent. Like some, and also like, what does that mean for your cornerbacks if a lot of offenses are coming, inside the numbers more and demanding more space, having more two-way goes? What do you want in your cornerback? Is that why a guy like Mike Sanders still maybe had a little more success outside than people thought he could? So that just fun thought experiment, and shows you the adaptive nature and the moving target nature of doing these evaluations.
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% right. And again, like, it goes back to kind of what goes into your best player available, analogous, even at a position, right? Like, are we looking for, what skill set are we looking for? What kind of guy does Jaden like to throw to? Like, what kind of person are you? All those things for a receiver, right? And corner, like everyone talks about Dan wanting like these big, long, tall corners, but I think he just likes good football players out there, right? Guys that can tackle, guys that take good angles, guys that understand coverage and can play the football. And so maybe that shifts your evaluation and what you value there at 29. And defensive end, I think, is another one that, like, in this draft specifically, like, there's going to be a lot of good value there. And so people say, oh, well, you signed all of these defensive linemen, and you did. But I think it's also important to you need to find a little bit of a seasoning, right? I think Jacob Martin, the guy they signed in free agency, has a little bit of that kind of pass rush juice. But I think you want somebody that you can kind of get in-house and kind of build around at that spot. And I do feel like at 29, there will be good value there, potentially for a really quality edge player, and so that's kind of where I'd go. And I think also safety too. Like, there's some really good kind of nickel safety hybrids in the draft. And I think one of those guys, because of, again, positional value is so weird, safety tends to be undervalued a little bit. I could slide there at 29 and get a really good football player.
Yeah, like, I don't think the Lions are mad that Brian Branch fell to them a couple of years ago, for instance. Like, you get a good one. Yeah, again, be good at your job. Draft a great football player. It doesn't matter the position. You're not going to go wrong. That does bring us to a conversation about the edge players, though, to wrap up the show.